Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. This is episode 145, Friday, July 19th. And we're going to talk about planning and time preferences. But first, a couple thoughts about the Trump assassination attempt aftermath. It was an assassination attempt. A lot of people who are Trump haters, regardless of affiliation, left, right, center, whatever, who want to believe and try to show that this was staged. I don't think it was staged. Of course, there are a lot of theories out there. There's a lot of information that has yet that has to come to light. Um, I have a lot of thoughts. My wife has a lot of thoughts. We share notes a lot. But there are just too many unknowns. But there are a couple of pieces of information which do challenge what a lot of people want to say is simply a staged event. Number one, the whole Microsoft meltdown, and that was global, mostly with the countries that use Microsoft. Very interesting, right? So imagine if the assassination actually did happen. You have the Republican National Convention, and then now you have all of these computer crashes, glitches. It's just kind of interesting. Also, it has come out that someone shorted Donald Trump's stock, much like just prior to 9/11, someone shorted a lot of stocks. And my understanding is that you're betting that the stock will um, crash, right? So people who are going to sell you that stock in order to short it, they think that there won't be a big price change. So if there is a big dive in the stock price, then you stand to make a lot of money. It's something like that. Like, I'm not an expert on this, but someone had some kind of information which led them to believe that they were going to make a killing. They took out a lot of short positions on his stock, hoping to make a lot of money, but then he's still alive, right? So it's very kind of interesting. The fact that it has happened before makes it really suspicious. So you have to be kind of naive to think that this is all coincidence, that this is just simply human error, that there was no sort of planning at all. It just seems almost impossible at this point. And the big tip off also is the idea, the concept that's floating around that he's a lone gunman. I don't know. It's that lone gunman thing has always, to my knowledge, more often than not, been kind of false, right? That obviously that person had a lot of help. So who helped him, right? So I'll leave it at that, but it's ongoing. There's all of this information that keeps coming out. There's a lot of bad information too, information that's put out as if it's legit. And it's because whoever started the rumor just likes to laugh at other people responding to the things that they say, right? That's their entertainment. So there's a lot of that going on as well. So, I try not to say too much and try to only base my own conspiracy theory on what I think is closer to being true than false. So anyway, more to the topic that I was thinking of doing today. And there are many possible topics, but I just got back from a funeral home and or the cemetery. And my wife and we decided that we were going to start pre-planning our funerals, right? So neither of us are planning on leaving each other. And so we pretty much, uh, started financing our funeral and also the burial, which is a lot of money, right? So, uh, especially if you look at inflation, the costs of a funeral easily will reach $20,000 today. So who knows how much it will be in the future. And so, just as you probably are, if you're listening to me, then you're familiar with the phenomena of inflation, how the dollars you hold on to today are going to be worth less in the future. So you want to use them to buy real things today, as another way of saving money, right? So uh, there are a lot of things that you have to consider in a funeral, not just the memorial service, compensating people who do work for, at least in the Asian society, you kind of give an honorarium to whoever is going to help you plan the funeral, people who play the music at the funeral, if you have any. Um, People who are going to sing, if they do sing, things like this, flowers, etc. Casket, grave marker, the actual grave plot. Now you have to also buy grave liners. They call it a vault so that you don't have cave-ins sometime in the future, right? When there's a little erosion. And so someone who's walking on top of your grave, they fall into a hole, to prevent this from happening. You have to buy a vault, et cetera, et cetera. And easily it will go $20,000, right? And we went mostly low end on all of the options, and still it was pretty pricey. If you wait, generally, you tend, out of guilt or out of emotion, you tend to buy more expensive options. And so that price tag will go much, much higher. My wife is always joking. I think she's joking around, but these days it seems more serious that she will get cremated, and that way you don't have to buy a casket. And she's hoping the burial costs will be, burial, digging up the dirt and then replacing the dirt, that will be a lot cheaper. I don't know. But anyway, Koreans in general don't like thinking about death. So I always talk about death, right? Um, Asians in general, I know specifically Koreans will refuse to live next to a cemetery or in sight of a cemetery. It's just sort of, even Christians, they won't do it, right? At least the first generation Koreans that spend some time in Korea, they just can't do it. And so they don't like thinking about death in general. So, what I always say at funerals is that this is the time to talk about living. And so I always talk about death when no one's really thinking about a funeral. So on any given Sunday, I'm always talking about death, planning, preparation, etc., because there's no emotional baggage uh, associated with me talking about death at that time. And then at the funeral, and this is probably why I'm not very popular, and a lot of people like to talk smack about me, but at the funeral, I always talk about living, right? So how you are supposed to live, right? What are you thinking about as you're living, because it's kind of an interesting thing where a lot of people don't think about death, or a lot of people believe that they won't see the inside of a funeral home ever. It's just kind of an interesting psychological thing that people go through. And so I always talk about living at a funeral, like I said, and always talk about death on any given Sunday. And it makes it a lot easier for me to do funerals for people in our church because they're already ready for it, right? And so we can talk about the next step moving forward. So planning, you want to talk about planning. So, beginning to pay for our end of life rituals got me thinking about planning, especially in today's world where there's so much inflation, right? As I said, because our currency is losing so much value so quickly, you kind of want to look for the things that you have to pay for in the future, but you're going to do it ahead of time with dollars that hold more value, right? Our church had bought grave plots 22 years ago. The price has gone up 12-fold, right? More than 12-fold. So whatever you do, the sooner you do it, you can think of it in terms of a long-term investment. It also means that you're committed to certain decisions that you make today, but that actually is how life is. We don't really see it. There's no concrete evidence of it. And most people forget after 20 years. But a lot of choices that we make today, they show up. The consequences of those choices show up decades in the future. So in a hyperinflation type situation, everyone is trying to get rid of their currency because if you hold on to it too long, then you won't be able to buy anything. That currency will be worthless by the time you get around to using it. If you have relatives who grew up in a different country, then they will tell you hyperinflation stories, right? My parents had hyperinflation stories. And so this kind of phenomena is not rare. It's not unusual. It's not like a black swan thing. But if you live in a country that has fiat currency, then you know that you're just waiting for the hyperinflation era moment event. So you try to lock in good prices today if you can. Now, my family, we don't really do vacations. We don't eat at restaurants. You know, we cut each other's hair. We do all of these things, mostly as a planning type activity, planning for the future, being ready for whatever happens in the future. And today it just happens that it was end of life ritual planning. Now, contrast this with the attitude of live in the moment. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but a few years ago, this was the number one cliche attitude among college students, live in the moment. And I thought that was kind of interesting because it just sort of all of a sudden everyone started talking about living in the moment. If you're familiar with Spartacus, I think it was HBO had a miniseries about Spartacus, and Andy Whitfield was the guy playing, I guess, the guy who's Spartacus. And he was diagnosed with cancer, and so he decided to video document his treatment and recovery process through video. And one of the themes that came up was to live in the moment, right? So they're not going to think about whether he lives or dies and go into depression, but he was going to enjoy every moment of every day, right? So to live that moment. So for him, it made a lot of sense, sure, because he already had his diagnosis and it turned out that he didn't live past that year. But what about all of the people who are not diagnosed with cancer? So all of these college students that were writing papers for me, and they were talking about living in the moment, but they weren't diagnosed with cancer. And so why did they say live in the moment? Because they didn't want the stress, right? The stress of looking at the news, of planning for the future, of trying to figure out what their major is, what they should do today to prepare for the future. Now, I didn't know anything about living in the moment, but I lived that way. I didn't want to think about that. And that actually is a very common phenomena. Young people who lack a lot of foresight and information and knowledge and awareness of how the world works don't think about the future. And this is why a lot of young people generally tend to make a lot of mistakes. Hopefully, the mistakes are not too costly, but sometimes they are very expensive. So hoping for loan forgiveness is not planning. Okay, just so we're clear, right? So if you're waiting for student loan forgiveness, and I say this half in jest, but I know people who were basically waiting for student loan forgiveness, and that was part of their financial planning. That's not real planning. Okay. And plus, if you are thinking in terms of integrity, well, you're not really, your loan is not being forgiven. You're forcing other people to pay for it. And so you can't be anti coercion and be waiting for loan forgiveness, right? For my part, I try to teach my children about money, about finances as much as I can with my limited knowledge. And I try to do that because my father didn't teach me anything. He didn't teach me boo about money. He said, "Oh, you'll learn about it in the future," and then, he never told me. And I had some really hard lessons to learn as a result of that. So you have people who are thinking about and pushing and prioritizing planning for the future. Then you have many people who are more concerned about living in the moment. So living in the moment doesn't require you to learn anything. It doesn't require you to have to think about consequences, possibilities, future, any of these stress giving ideas, right? So it made me think about time preferences. And it turns out that the Austrian economics talks about time preferences. And so there are two types of time preferences: high time preference and low time preference. So the easy way to remember this is if you have a high time preference, right, you're in a hurry. I need it now, right? So time is of the essence. So I got to do it now. And low time preference is, oh, I can wait. Okay. So high time preference means that you need to spend your money today, now. I want to go on vacation now. I want to, throw this huge party now, right? And so the high time preference is more about consumption, spending money now. And that's, you see that a lot today among young people because they have no hope of buying a home. The hope is on the future is uncertain. Why am I saving my money if I don't get a return, et cetera, et cetera. Low time preference is thinking about the future, and generally it results in saving, right? So even though I started funeral planning and financing, someone might say, "Oh, you spent money." Well, yeah, but it's with a mind of saving money, right? So I'm actually buying funeral plots, locking in a price. And so if you look at inflation, if inflation goes crazy, then I still have to pay that. And so really it's you're at the very least, you're, making or saving the inflation rate, whatever inflation becomes, your purchase is unaffected by that. And Austrian economics also says that low time preference leads to economic development, to civilization, and high time preference, massive consumption, leads eventually to poverty, right? To less civilization. Now, at that point, everything becomes subjective, right? Because everyone living their life has to make their choices based on their personal goals, their outlook for the future. So for some people, what might look like a high time preference, right? I got to buy this now. I got to do this now. Is for that person actually a low time preference choice, right? So it's very subjective. And so no one can ever really say what everyone should do at any given moment. But we should always keep that in mind. Is what I am doing an investment for the future? Or is it just simply, I want to enjoy this? I want to have fun. I don't care what will happen as a result. Like one of the things that I used to say was, I'm living my life burning my candle at both ends, right? Because I don't care if I die young. I said that a lot when I was younger. And I tried to live that way, cut back on my sleep, dramatically so I can have more time doing the things that I wanted to do, things like this. Um, but the point is that there are many possible futures for each of us, all of them sort of being more and more clear based on the decisions that we make today. The more that you think about the future, the less you are surprised by the events that occur, and you have fewer regrets. I still have regrets like, oh, I should have done this or I should have done that. I always have them, but it helps me to be more careful about the choices that I make moving forward. So part of my philosophy of life, in addition to, the two principles that I always say: no coercion, no hypocrisy, my faith. But also, I try to live every day like it's my last. And so everyone will say, "Oh, that means you're going to have fun, spend all your money." Well, no, not really. So if you ever have the time, watch the movie Bucket List. with Jack Nicholson and guy from Shawshank. Oh, I'm blanking on his name. Um, anyway, so they both were given a disease which has a terminal diagnosis, right? So they were both going to die. They think they're both going to die. And so they try to go through their bucket list because Jack Nicholson's character is really wealthy. And so we can do anything. And so, not to get, well, you probably won't watch the movie. So just to give you the ending. So at one point, oh man, then Morgan Freeman, he kind of says, I'm going home. And he realizes that the way that he wants to live to the fullest his life is to spend it with people that he loves, right? That so rather than doing fun, it's about creating memories, it's about being with the people he cares about the most and who care about him the most, rather than going all over the world partying with this guy he barely knows, spend it with his loved ones. And so that's kind of what I do, right? It doesn't matter to me that I don't really go on a lot of vacations. Maybe it matters to my wife or my children a lot, but they don't really seem to mind. But spending quality time with them is basically how I decided that I was going to basically live every day like it's my last, and to live it in the fullest I can possibly, right? So living as responsibly as possible, not just for myself, but for the benefit of my family. So just sharing some thoughts with you in these crazy times, maybe to sort of give us an anchor, a reference point to try to figure out where we move or how we move forward given all of this uncertainty. Uh, anyway, hope you enjoyed it. Like it. Give me some just suggestions for topics, whatever, and I'll talk to you next week.